Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk on Tailwind and CSS. Before we get started, just a quick note to say that I've tweeted a link to my slides and also all the code examples. So if you check out the live chat, there's a GitHub link in there, and that will have the slides and also all the code I'm going to be talking about. So if you find the code samples hard to read or Zoom over compresses them, you can grab them there. So let's get started. A little bit about me. My name's Phil. You can find me in all the usual places. The important thing about this slide is that I work at an agency in the United Kingdom. So the sort of projects I work on are quite big, quite long-running projects. They're projects that involve a lot of different developers, and some of those developers would have been making websites for all their career, and some of them will be very new to it. So we have a variety of skills, a variety of levels of experience, and also the commercial pressures of being an agency. So we need to offer good value for money to our clients, and we also need to do good business ourselves. So let's start with talking about CSS. CSS is hard, but it looks easy. Someone on their first day at work, you could give them a CSS job because, you know, it's just CSS. You could say, go and change the color of all the buttons on the website from blue to green. And it probably wouldn't take them that long. It's a safe change, it's global, it affects the whole website. So they get that job done, and before you know it, they're a front-end developer, woohoo. But then things get hard quickly, complexity ramps up. Before you know it, you're explaining to them how Z-index works and what a stacking context is, and why when they made something absolutely positioned, it changed the Z-index value, but didn't really change it, it just affected it. And also, you know, my position sticky doesn't work anymore because I put overflow hidden on a parent way up in the DOM. So it looks trivial, but it's really not. It's undervalued, and true CSS experts are rare to find. And because they're rare to find, the rest of us get frustrated, right? Virtual show of hands, how many of you have experienced things like this? Being afraid to delete things, being afraid to change things, not knowing where something's reused, fighting the cascade, fighting overrides, experiencing brittle bonds between the markup you write and the code, and just generally things getting messy with time. Well, we're going to be talking about how utility-first CSS can help with some of those concerns. We'll talk about what it is, we'll address some common criticisms, we'll talk about using it with Drupal, and then we'll finish off with me saying what I think the benefits are. So a bit about how I got interested in this area. Well, I was working on a travel company website. It's quite a high-end travel company. They own like desert islands. The Clooneys got married at their place in Venice. So it's a really high-end, visually rich website, but essentially it's just a brochureware website. It's just a lot of pictures and videos. And the site was slow. We'd inherited it from another agency. I think they'd been looking at it, a place down in London, for about 2 years or 3 years. And then we'd had it for a while too. And everyone knew the code base was messy because everyone hated working on it. It was unpredictable, it was difficult, but we didn't know how messy it was. We'd all been used to working in the Sass files, but we hadn't really delved into the generated CSS. So I thought, well, we better have a look. And I was kind of amazed, kind of shocked at just how it was. To give you an idea of the size of it, the size of the generated CSS that we were sending to every single page was the Drupal 7 site. If I printed it out, it would have been 184 sides of A4. And I wish we were doing this conference in Barcelona, because I would have printed it out on recycled paper and thrown it across the stage, and it would have been an amazing visual device. But yeah, 184 sides of A4, 1.1 megabytes. It had 100 different media queries in it. And this wasn't a project that had been worked on by bad developers. We didn't inherit it from a sort of cowboy agency that was trying to scam their customers. It was just a project that was subject to the real world. things like staff turnover, things like client requirements changing, things like working on large teams where not everyone is a CSS expert, but sometimes something needs to be done, so there's only one person to work on it. And it got me thinking, what can we do to stop this happening again? So I started looking at articles, blog posts, talks about scalable CSS. So CSS that stays manageable with time rather than becoming unmanageable with time. I found this blog post by a person called Adam Morse, who just started a new job at Salesforce, I think, a big US tech company. And like me with the travel website, he was going through their generated CSS. And he kind of had a mixture of horror and amazement at how messy it was. It was full of duplication, overrides, things being used in really odd ways. But the only thing he saw that made sense to him was a class called float left. And all float left did was apply float left. This was 2016, so we were using a lot of floats. And Adam's conclusion was that we write and we duplicate too much CSS because when we add new features, we default to writing new CSS instead of reusing existing CSS. But the only true way to make CSS genuinely reusable enough is to have it work at a very, very low level. And that low level is utility first. So let's say we want to build one of these. It's like a chat notification, chat bubble, that sort of thing. Here's how we might make it now. So it's quite simple, it's quite clean markup, but it's really tied to one use. It's always going to be a chat notification with a name like chat notification. Maybe that's a bad name, maybe that limits the reusability, but naming things is hard. The component author, they've also had to come up with silly names, things like chat notification logo wrapper, and they're probably only using that to apply a flexbox class, maybe just like one property and value pair. Is it really worth having to come up with names for everything just to do one line of CSS? Maybe. If we imagine the CSS for this site, they're going to have a lot of components. Each component has its CSS wrapped up in chat notification, download notification, whatever. Things like colors, things like line heights, things like font sizes, they're going to be repeated over and over again. On this component, we'll have font sizes and line heights and text colors set on chat notification title and chat notification message. But these are global design tokens. They are things that span the whole site. They're things that are inherent to that organization's brand. They're not really component concerns, and they're going to be repeated over and over again. And like, how many display flexes does one style sheet need? Well, with utility first, this is how you build that component. So with utility first, we default to styling elements by applying pre-existing classes directly in the HTML. We don't write new CSS unless we have to. And these classes, you can see there's lots of them. It looks messy, there's lots of classes, but each one only does one thing, and they're generated for us automatically by a tool based on what we tell that tool to do. So we'll tell it what font sizes we want to use, we'll tell it what colors we want to use, we'll tell it our spacing scales, and then it will generate all these classes for us. And because of that, we don't end up with repetition. If I want to make a component display flex, I won't have to write component name display flex, I'll just add the flex class. So these things only exist in our CSS once. If we need to do component specific CSS, like maybe a gradient or an animation, that's fine. We can do that the traditional way, because it's utility first, not utility only. And what that means is we start off with these utility classes, and if they're getting in the way, if they're not practical, then we do it the traditional way. So you might be thinking, I'm not convinced, that is gross. And that's fine, because most people, they don't love this at first sight. But more and more people are trying it. You probably won't like it until you try it. It's one of those things. But when you do try it, you'll be in good company. all of these organizations use utility first or something very similar for, if not their main site, then perhaps a sub product or perhaps an admin panel or something like that. This is some data from a survey. It's from the State of CSS Survey 2020. Now, this survey is not representative of all developers. It skews towards people in the Western world. It skews towards people who have time to answer surveys on Twitter. But it found that 87% of people who've tried Tailwind would use it again. And that's a trend you see quite a lot on things like Twitter. People are anti-Tailwind, they try it, they're kind of convinced, they try it a bit more, and then they stick with it. I've been using it for over 2 years on Drupal 8 projects. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to try and share why I enjoy it so much. So you probably have a few concerns if you've not used utility first CSS before. Let's run through those concerns. So a common one is, isn't this just the same as inline styles? And the idea here is that we know inline styles are bad, therefore utility first looks like inline styles, therefore utility first must be bad too. But while they might look similar, there's really important differences. There's a lot that inline styles can't do. Like, good luck putting a media query in inline styles. And without media query, you can't have responsive, you can't have Windows high contrast mode, you can't have dark mode. And with inline styles, once we put something in an inline style, it's really hard to update it. Some people make that argument about utility first too, but they're still classes and they only come from one source, which is the Tailwind CSS file, whereas a color referenced in an inline style would be all over your code base. Another really important thing is specificity. Now, people who make this argument, it's just like inline styles, they're judging a CSS methodology, so they should probably know more about specificity. Specificity is a score that the browser uses to decide whether or not CSS overrides other CSS. And generally, a lower score is thought of as better, because that makes it more easy to override the style in if you have to. Now, utility classes, they're just standard CSS classes, so they get a specificity score of 10. But inline style have a specificity score of 1000. So there's a slight difference there. And finally, inline styles are free for all. They're a blank canvas. You can put any value you want into them and things can quickly get out of hand. Now that doesn't apply with Tailwind, because Tailwind generates all these classes for us based on a configuration file. So it comes with some sensible defaults. You could use it out of the box, but if you're using it in a professional context, you probably match it to the designs or to an existing design system for that client. So in here, we define fonts, colors, font size scales, margin and padding scales, basically everything down to like transition durations, transition easing functions. And this is really cool because it's just a JavaScript file. So we can load this into our own scripts and we can do things like generate Sass variables to use in third-party or legacy CSS or SCSS. We can export it to JSON, export it to YAML to use in Drupal for things like color picker fields or in something like Pattern Lab. And Tailwind is a post-CSS plugin. It reads this config file and it generates classes for us. So by filling in that config file, we've created basically a design system. We've made an API that allows consumers, in this case, the HTML and the developers writing it, to only use our approved values. So as long as developers stick to using the classes generated by Tailwind, they can accidentally introduce new font sizes, new colors, or other elements that are not part of that site's brand. And it's really good for developers too, because we can open up DevSource and see a list of all the available classes. If we type in text, it'll start giving us all the text color classes. We know what's available, we know what's safe to use. And as a result, we end up with a harmonious and a consistent user interface with less decision-making slowing down developers. So here we can see there's a set width scale. Here we can see there's a set of colors. And here we can say there's a set of typefaces or fonts. So another thing inline styles can't do is responsive web design. So let's talk about how Tailwind does that. Well, each utility class in Tailwind can have a prefix put in front of it. And that prefix can be a breakpoint name. So for example, SM or MD for small or medium. So Tailwind is mobile first. So we start off with our mobile first classes. Here it's a 1-column grid. And then as we increase the breakpoint, our small classes kick in. So now it's a 2-column grid, the padding changes and the gap between elements changes. Finally, on the medium breakpoint, some more padding classes kick in too. And this is verbose, yes, it looks messy initially, but everything's in one place. It's not spread between your markup and your CSS, and it's not spread between different media query definitions. There's no shifting between different files to do one single task. By the way, a similar approach is used for things like add-in hover states, focus states, things like that, so interactivity stuff. Now you might be thinking, how am I going to remember all of these classes? Well, any CSS methodology has its own naming schemes, right? It's always got its own conventions. But at least with Tailwind, the names are functional. So they describe what something does. It's kind of obvious what, flex does once you've used it a few times. But when you're using a semantic system, it's hard to remember whether you should be using card -- promoted, or is it card -- featured, or is it card -- highlighted? If you know CSS already, you'll pick up the Tailwind classes quite quickly. If you work with CSS and I say to you relative, you'll probably think position relative. If I say to you flex, you'll probably think display flex. And those are the right Tailwind classes to use. Besides, the latest version of PHP Storm, it's got your back. It reads your Tailwind config file and it gives you autocomplete. And there's a similar plugin for Visual Studio Code too. In fact, the Visual Studio Code plugin is actually developed by Tailwind themselves because they care about developer experience. Now, this is a thorny issue. Separation of concerns is a long-standing idea. It reminds us of things like CSS Zen Garden in the early noughties, where the idea was that one single document could be completely transformed by different CSS files because markup, content, and styling were absolutely separate. But it's an idea that's first of all more of a principle than a real-world practice. And it's also an idea that kind of predates component-based designs, kind of predates effective templating systems. And how many times have you sort of redesigned a whole website just by changing the CSS? Generally, not always, but generally, we change the markup too. So the argument against the separation of concerns worry is expressed much better than I can do it by these 2 blog posts on the right-hand side. I'll tweet the links to them afterwards, or you can grab the slides and there's links in there. One blog post is by Adam Watton, who wrote Tailwind, so, pinch of salt and everything. The second blog post is written by someone called Sarah Dayan, who works at Algolia in France and is a big Tailwind fan. The quote, separation of concerns is not equal to separation of file types. That's actually a quote from the Vue.js documentation. So you may know Vue has a concept of single file components, where your components scripting, markup, and styling all lives in one file. People make separation of concerns worries about that. But what they're saying there is that they live in one file, but it's still, the right tool is still being used for the job. So the CSS is handled by CSS. It's not sort of being applied somehow through JavaScript or something. And one way I like to think about this is it's still CSS, Tailwind. Like people say Tailwind goes against all the history of the internet, but it's still CSS. It's just being applied in a really, really, really granular way. Another concern is maintainability. So this is where we're going to start talking about Drupal a bit more. In Drupal, we build systems. We don't build individual pages. We have field templates. We have node templates. We have entities that reference each other. All of these things are, well, they can be seen as discrete parts. They can be seen as components. In a component-based website, we would have a single button.twig file. And whenever we want the markup for a button, we'd reference that file. We'd include it in Twig. We wouldn't have 100 references to the button markup. We'd have one reference to we'd have 100 references to the one file that provides the markup. And that's really important because without this, utility first won't work. If you're not building things in a component-based way, this isn't practical to use. But a lot of people are doing component-based work in Drupal and have been for a while. So let's run through it quickly. It's a big change in thinking. We rely a lot less on adding classes to things, and instead we rely more on the markup. So everything that's used in one place becomes a Twig component with single source and markup, no repetition of classes. And then instead of adding one class, for example, .card to lots of different places, so we might add it to a node display mode, we might add it to a paragraph, we might add it to a views result row. Instead of doing that, those three different Drupal concepts will all include the one Twig file. So here's an example of an accordion item component. And this could be used in a paragraph, it could be used in a block to show some facets, it could be used on an e-commerce page to show some product information. So we use Twig functions like embed or include to load the file. We pass in a load of variables, which we can think of as sort of arguments for the component or parameters. And we can also pass in blocks of content we want Drupal to show or to render. Then inside that file, this is where all the utility classes live. So we use the Drupal attributes object, which has been around since, I think, early version 8. And we actually use a Pattern Lab plugin, so we can use this object in Pattern Lab. We use the old PHP version of Pattern Lab, which is why it's easier to do that. And you can see we're adding a few classes. We add accordion item, block, BG Gray 25. And in these examples, which are taken from my Drupal work, all the utility classes are prefixed with U. That's just a Tailwind setting, and it means we don't have Drupal block classes clashing with Tailwind block classes. And we're adding some classes conditionally here. If we look at the bottom, we can see that isActive, which is a class used by our JavaScript, is only added if isFirst is true. And isFirst would be an argument we passed into that component if it was the first one in that set of paragraphs. So here's a separate and slightly bigger example. We've got a lot of classes here, but they're all on their own line. So it's easy to find existing ones, delete them, add new ones. And on lines 13 and 14, we're using a ternary in Twig. So that's the question mark and then the colon. And we're using this to swap between two different color related classes based on the value that this getAudience function returns. This is an example of doing color scheming work right inside Twig with no Sass, no CSS custom properties. So this site has a residential audience, a commercial audience, and they both have a different color scheme. So getting started with components in Drupal, you'll probably end up using the components module. The UI patterns ecosystem is really useful too. And this GitHub repository by Alexit is just an amazing resource full of related articles, related modules, themes, starter kits, basically everything you need to do component-based design in Drupal. And if you're not doing component-based stuff already, like it's the way to go for big sites, absolutely. You'll also want a lot of template suggestions. The more the merrier. Add as many as you can in your theme. You can use modules like FormDazzle or template suggester to get even more template suggestions. It'll really make your life easier because we're going to be doing a lot more in markup now. So let's get into another example. Let's say we've got a long text field, a CK editor field, and we want to space out the paragraphs inside that field by a consistent amount. And we also want to control that spacing. So in our footer, we might have this field, but we want it to be really narrow because it's just got copyright information and all that sort of legal small print stuff. We might have it in a tab or an accordion, and we might want it slightly compressed there as well. So here's how we do it in the traditional way. You can see we're using Sass, and then that gets turned into CSS, and the asterisk plus asterisk selector. That's a super useful little CSS trick. It's called the lobotomized owl because it looks like an owl with the eyes crossed out. And what that means is target any element that has a preceding element. So we use that to add a margin top between things. That's a fine approach. It would just get a bit messy if we were adding lots and lots of overrides, and it doesn't fit with our new utility first workflow. So let's look at how to do it in a markup centric way that'll play nicely with Tailwind. So This is a Drupal specific template, field -- text long.html.twig. What we're doing here is we're using some Twig, which is actually calling PHP methods behind the scenes. We could also be doing this in a pre-process, but to make it easier to show in one slide, I put it all in one file. So we're working out the parent entity of the field, and then we're using the paragraphs API to work out what is hosting this paragraph. And we use this information to set a variable called space and level. Space and level is an integer, it's 1 or it's 2. And then at the bottom, you can see we're including our WYSIWYG text atom, and that's this file here. So this is a non-Drupal specific template. Fair enough, we're using the attributes object in here, but there's no mentions of fields here. There's no content render array, that sort of thing. This is where we set our spacing classes. So we've already told Tailwind to generate these UO1, UO2, UO3 classes. And now we're using Twig to set up a lookup table. So this is the Twig hash of spacing related classes mapped against the spacing values 1, 2, 3 that we set earlier. And we're using Twig's attribute function, which is a way of accessing nested data to pick the right class from the lookup table. Using the lookup table is good because we can do find and replace easily, and also avoiding string concatenation is important for CSS purging, which we'll talk about later on. So our templates do look more complicated now. There's a lot more going on in Twig or in pre-processes, but we've also removed all the complexity of the CSS. So we're shifting complexity around, but in doing so, we're making a system that's more predictable, and the CSS code base has fewer overrides, no matter how many variants we add in the future. So you might be thinking, yeah, this sounds like a really big change. Is it worth it? Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. That's why I'm giving this talk. Let's run through a few of the reasons why I really like utility first and why I think it's right for the teams that I work in, at least. So this is a CSS Tricks article written by Mr. CSS Tricks himself, Chris Coyer. And he says, oh no, our style sheets grow and grow and grow. And he coined the term Append Only Css. What Append Only Css means is what this quote says. Projects go on, the days tick by, everyone adds CSS, but no one removes it. Things get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we can see that quantified in this blog post by a person called John Polalek. So he started a new role and they were using traditional CSS. And he noticed that each deployment, they wrote more features, they wrote more CSS, and it was on a pretty solid growth. They were on a bad trajectory. But then he convinced his team to try a refactor to utility first CSS, or as he calls it, atomic CSS. And instantly, their code base dropped to below its original size when he joined. But the most important thing is, it stayed low. The code base, the CSS code base, it didn't increase in size. It stayed flat. In fact, it actually shrunk because he found more and more ways to optimize it. So yeah, his HTML probably got more verbose, but CSS is something we generally send to almost every page. And it's also something that's render blocking. So it's really, really important to have a small CSS file. You still write some new CSS. That's why it's utility first, not utility only. You write per component breakpoints, you write pseudo content, some custom gradients, for example. But your CSS can finally stop growing. And we've seen that loads of times at CTI, where I work. When we added Solar Site Search to our internal distribution, our sort of starter kit, using a utility first CSS approach and a component-based design meant the only CSS we needed to write for that whole page, the form, the facets, the cards, was the code you see on the right-hand side. And all we were doing there was overriding the default as the styling of the mark HTML element, which is like an element to highlight stuff. It gets even better though, because that feature took like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of Sass. But when we added our blog functionality, it added no new CSS at all. So we added blog listings, we added author information, we added individual blog post pages, and we did all of it without writing any new CSS. Now you might be thinking, Isn't a Tailwind CSS file massive though, if it's got all this CSS I need? Yeah, it is massive during development. But when you build your production ready CSS, Tailwind uses an open source package called Purge Css. And we configure Purge Css to scan through all of the files that might have utility classes in them. So you can point at anything. Point at your Twig templates, point at your Drupal config files, point at your JavaScript files, and it learns what classes we use, and it removes any Tailwind classes that aren't in use. And that means that people's Tailwind files generally get down to sort of about 15 kilobytes. So our CSS is going to get smaller, but it also gets nicer to work with. CSS is a global scope. It's one of the few things in programming where we want a global scope, and it needs a global scope to work in the way CSS has been designed to work. It's a really powerful feature, but it's one that frustrates people. People accidentally change things because they don't know where else CSS is being relied on. You have to think about who might use work in the future and how reliable and how reusable it is. But utility classes, they're added to a component and they'll only affect that component. So all of a sudden, we've now got a local scope, which makes it a lot easier for people. It makes it easier to change a component without worrying that you're rewriting some CSS that someone else might be relying on. You only need to think about one at a time. You don't need to try and hold the whole CSS code base in your head and work out the cascade, work out specificities, all that sort of thing. So let's deal with another CSS frustration, naming things. You saw in that example earlier, we were naming chat notification logo wrapper. You've probably at some point had to come up with a name like news cards inner wrapper, just to apply a small amount of CSS. You've probably heard this joke before. There's only two hard things in computer science, cache invalidation and naming things. And I mean, let's face it, we're Drupal developers. We've got enough problems with the cache as it is. Let's not worry about naming things. BEM style, block element modifier, is quite brain intensive. It requires context shifting and it slows us down. We need to come up with good names for blocks, good names for elements, good names for modifiers. Then we need to worry about where does one component end and another one start? Should I break this into a new block? And even when we come up with good names, sometimes requirements change and now the name doesn't make sense anymore. No one can predict the future. But with utility first, because we're not coming up with these component-based or semantic hooks classes, we don't need to make names for them. We just use our pre-existing classes. And because we're not coming up with names, we can focus more on development. And that makes things fast, like really, 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 really fast. We can build whole components in the browser. We can open up DevTools. We can go to that little classes bit where it auto-completes the classes. We can add things, remove things, change things. There's no waiting for Sass to run. There's no waiting for post CSS to run. Development can happen almost as fast as you can type. Now, I'm not sure how well Zoom is showing it, but there's a super distracting GIF on the right-hand side of this slide, and it's showing someone building a clone of the Instagram Stories user interface from scratch in about 9 or 10 minutes, all without leaving their browser. So this is really good for productivity, and it's really good for focus because we're doing a lot less context shifting. Now, the cascade is a fundamental part of CSS. It's super important. It's how it works. It's how it was designed. But it's also the source of a lot of people's frustration. Now, utility classes are all single classes. They're not long selectors, and they're either added or they're not. So that means they always have the same specificity. So the only thing that controls whether one overrides the other is source order in the Tailwind CSS file. And it also means it's really easy to see why something's happening. If something has a red background, it's because someone has added BG red or BG danger or BG whatever you want to either that element or something higher up in the DOM. But in the DOM, we don't have to worry about the CSS file, the cascade. When something goes wrong, when we're debugging, we don't have to work our way up and down all of the applied classes. We don't need to work out what it is that's overriding our code and then how to rewrite that code so it still does the job it was originally designed to do, but doesn't override our work, and our work still works. And that sort of thing it's durable, you can teach yourself, you can be trained, but it's slow and it's prone to error. So where we can remove the cascade, it might be a smart thing to do. It goes against some things that CSS was designed for, so purists might hate it, but in the real world, it makes life easier. It means we can deliver things quicker, and it means we can focus time on doing new features, bug fixes, quality, rather than being a purist. And besides, we can still use the cascade where it's the best tool for the job. Utility first, not utility only. For example, Tailwind provides a typography or prose plugin. And the design for this plugin is that it styles CMS content. So in Drupal, we could use that to style content that comes from CK Editor. We wouldn't hack CK Editor to add load of classes to our headlines. We'd let the prose plugin handle it. Let's talk a bit about making it harder for people to make mistakes. So utilities only allow set values to be applied. So they enforce consistency and they help guide people towards doing the right thing. And this lowers the barrier to entry and it makes it easier for non-CSS experts to do user interface work safely. These are kind of like the bumpers. Like if you're bad at bowling like me, you go bowling, maybe if you're not embarrassed, you'll put up the bumpers on the side. And this means you can still take part, you can still have fun, you won't get frustrated as much. With traditional CSS, there's no bumpers, there's no guardrails. Everything we write is a blank canvas and we can fill it with anything we want. We can add darken functions from Sass that results in an off-brand color. Or maybe someone accidentally sets the font size to 1.2 rem instead of 1.33 m. Maybe someone forgets there's a mixin they should be using. By forcing people to use only these classes, we also make developers and designers stick to the system. Designers have to use the spacing scales and the grids because otherwise we can't build their work. They can't add in magic numbers that look good in Photoshop but don't work on a real responsive website. And with all of these arguments for utility first, not just this one, but all the points I made in this slide, there will always be people saying, if you did traditional CSS properly, you wouldn't have these problems. If you were stricter about code review and variable and mixin use, you'd be fine. If you taught yourself or you were trained better, you wouldn't worry so much about CSS. And they're right, but in the real world, in the commercial world, this kind of messiness happens all the time. Here's some CSS stats from some high-profile tech companies in 2017. GitLab, no one needs 59 font sizes. GitHub, no one needs 163 text colors. Everyone can get it wrong, and that's why guardrails are great. Fun fact, since 2017, GitLab, Stripe, and GitHub have all switched to using utility-first CSS for some or all of their sites. They've added it to their main site, they've added it to a new design system, or they've added it to internal tools. Utility first won't make sense for everyone, but more and more people are trying it, and more people are discovering it works for them. Even if you don't think it's right for you, it's great to have the option. So in conclusion, using Tailwind of Drupal will benefit from a change in mindset and developing some new skills. It's not an easy change. There's complexity when it comes to templating. There's complexity when it comes to components to make sure you don't repeat yourself, but it's worked well for us. We've seen much fewer visual regression bug tickets being raised. I can't remember the last time that me or someone on my team accidentally changed the appearance of something by accident. I'm sure it happens, but I don't remember it. We've also got less complex code bases now. We can go back to a project from 2 years ago and we know what classes to use. It doesn't feel messy. Most importantly, people tell me that when they work on old projects that don't use Tailwind, or they help out our Magento teams or our Umbraco teams that don't use Tailwind yet, they miss it and they say it's nice to come back to using utility first. So thank you very much. We've got a few minutes for questions, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 minutes. Don't forget the contribution opportunities. Don't forget to give feedback, and bear with me a moment while I jump into the on-air platform and look at what questions people have been asking. So let's see. How many twigs do you have to override with only Tailwind classes? A lot, because that's how we do things by default now. We live in Twig markup. We don't live in CSS files anymore. It makes life a bit harder. There's a training issue where we have to get people used to that, but it's more predictable. We're not relying on the override. We're just relying on whether or not a class is added. If you had to handle multiple footer blocks on the same page, how would you apply this approach? We'd probably have them as custom blocks. So we'd have a custom block plugin, which would then give it a machine name. And we'd then have a custom Twig suggestion for that block with machine name, or maybe even use a core one. And then each block would have its own template file. And we could all reference, so maybe we've got 3 Drupal Twig template files. They could all reference the one single component, but we could pass in different arguments to do different things. Is there a performance impact by having so many Twig files? That's a really good question. I think the answer there is perhaps, but we rely so heavily on the render cache. Drupal is working with Twig anyway. It's working through all the suggestions. So whether it uses my custom block.twig or it uses the core block.html.twig, it's still running everything through Twig, but that output is hopefully being cached.
Sorry for interrupt, but we have to finish.
Okay, that's great. I will answer any remaining questions by text on the On Air platform, and you can also follow me on Twitter and I'll help out on there. Thanks a lot for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session.